Hello, and thank you for joining for tonight's story. I hope you enjoy. Whisper Lake Skinwalker. The thing about old rangers, the ones who stick around long enough, is they develop habits, little rituals, unshakable routines. David Flogsworth had been wiping his boots on the same frayed mat outside Station 7 for 19 years straight. Not a day missed, even in blizzards. Even when the fever had him sweating through his uniform back in '09. The mat was bald in the middle now, its edges curling up like dried bark. David's fingers brushed the spine of the notebook as he pulled it from the drawer beneath his bunk. The leather was cracked, brittle as autumn leaves, and the pages smelled of damp and something faintly metallic. He'd found it tucked behind a loose panel in the wall, hidden as if the last ranger hadn't wanted it found at all. The first dozen pages were mundane: supply lists, weather notes, the occasional complaint about squirrels nesting in the outhouse vents. Routine. But then, halfway down page 14, the handwriting changed. Not in style, but in urgency. The letters dug into the paper like claw marks. David's thumb hovered over the page where the entries took a turn. The ink had bled in places, as if the writer's hand had trembled. April 17th, heard it again last night. Not an owl, not a coyote. Something that walked on two legs but didn't walk right. Like it was learning how. A chill prickled the back of David's neck. He'd heard stories, of course. Every ranger had whispers about Station 7 being thin, a place where the woods didn't follow the usual rules. But he'd always chalked it up to old-timers spooking rookies. David flipped to the next page and the breath stalled in his chest. The entry was dated 3 days after the last, the writing frantic, slanted sideways as if scribbled in haste. It mimics voices now, not just animals, human ones. Heard Marjorie calling for me from the tree line tonight. Marjorie's been dead 6 years. A coffee stain bloomed across the corner of the page, brown and old. David's fingers twitched. He knew Marjorie. She'd been the station cook before him, died of a stroke in her sleep. Quiet woman, always humming. The notebook fell shut with a dry snap. David exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose pane above the sink, the one he'd been meaning to fix since spring. He rubbed his thumb over the notebook's cover, tracing the indentation where something sharp had once gouged the leather. A memory surfaced. Old Man Harlow, his first supervisor, tossing a shot of whiskey back before muttering, "Nothing good ever comes from poking at what the woods have hidden." David set the notebook down just as the wind outside gave an unnatural shudder, not a gust, but a hesitation, like the forest itself had caught its breath. The radio on his desk crackled with static, though he hadn't touched the dials. He stared at it, waiting. The static resolved into a voice, not his supervisor's, not any ranger's, but a warble of syllables that almost formed words. Then silence. The radio hissed again, louder this time, and David's hand hovered over the volume knob, not to turn it down but to press his ear closer. The voice, if it was a voice, didn't speak. It breathed, wet and ragged like lungs full of creek water, then clear as a bell, "David." David's hand jerked back from the radio as if burned. The voice, his name, hadn't come from the speaker. It had come from behind him, from the direction of the cabin's single rain-fogged window. He spun, heart hammering, but the glass showed only his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. Outside, the pines swayed in a wind that hadn't been there a moment ago. David's breath fogged the window as he pressed closer, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved but branches. Yet the voice had been right there, close enough to feel the damp heat of its breath on his neck. His fingers found the service pistol at his hip, thumb flicking the holster strap loose. A reflex. He'd drawn it exactly twice in 30 years, both times for black bears too curious for their own good. David didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk with the lamp off, the notebook open to the last entry, his service revolver resting on the page like a paperweight. The wind had died down by midnight, leaving behind a silence so thick it rang in his ears. Then, just before dawn, the scratching started, not at the door, but underneath the cabin, like something with too many joints was testing the floorboards. By sunrise, the scratches had stopped, but the unease hadn't. David stepped outside, his breath misting in the cold air, and found the footprints waiting for him. They circled the cabin twice, toes dragging in the dirt like the thing that made them had been limping, or pretending to. The prints vanished at the tree line, as if whatever left them had dissolved into the shadows. The radio crackled to life mid-morning. Dispatch reported a missing hiker, a college kid named Eric Langley, last seen heading into David's sector 2 days prior. No check-in, no trail markers. David packed his gear slowly, methodically, like if he moved carefully enough, the woods might not notice. Eric's campsite was pristine, too pristine. The tent zipper was shut, the sleeping bag rolled tight, a half-eaten granola bar on a log like he'd just stepped away. David's fingers brushed the bar, still soft, no more than a day old. Then he saw the tracks, deep, uneven, the right foot dragging just like the ones outside his cabin. They led into the trees, then stopped dead at a patch of ferns. David crouched by the fern patch, fingertips brushing the crushed fronds. The tracks didn't just stop, they ended, as if the thing that made them had been plucked straight up into the canopy. He straightened, scanning the branches overhead. Nothing. Just the sway of pine boughs in a wind that smelled faintly of wet earth and something sour, like spoiled milk. A twig snapped to his left. David turned, hand on his holster, but the forest was still, too still. No chatter of squirrels, no rustle of undergrowth, just that same thick silence he'd felt at the cabin. Then, soft as a sigh, help. The voice was Eric's, or a perfect mimicry of it. David's throat tightened. He'd met Eric once at a trailhead briefing last spring. The kid had asked 3 times about bear spray. "Eric," David called, forcing his voice steady. The forest swallowed the name whole. Another snap, closer this time. "Over here." The voice came from 20 feet ahead, near a cluster of birch trees. David took a step forward, then froze. His training screamed at him. Asterisk, no missing person ever calls from cover, asterisk. But his feet moved anyway, drawn by some primal itch to see. The birch trunks were slender, their bark peeling in papery curls. Between them, something glistened. David's boot sank into the damp earth as he edged closer to the birches. The glistening thing resolved into strands, long, wet strands, dangling from a low branch like tinsel. He reached out, fingertips brushing the slick tendrils before recoiling. Hair. Human hair, dark and matted with something thicker than rainwater. Above it, the birch bark was gouged in parallel slashes, fresh sap oozing down the trunk. "Help me," the voice came again, now from his right, closer to the ground. David's pulse hammered in his temples as he crouched, peering beneath the underbrush. A shape hunched there, its back to him, shoulders shuddering. Eric's orange jacket, same brand the kid had worn at the trailhead. David's breath hitched. "Eric, don't move." The figure turned its head. Not all the way. Just enough to show the profile of a face that was almost Eric's. If Eric's jaw had unhinged like a snake's, if his teeth had grown slender and translucent as icicles. The thing smiled, and David's vision tunneled. He stumbled back, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion, but the figure didn't lunge. It melted, collapsing into the ferns with a sound like wet newspaper tearing. The forest exhaled. Birdsong erupted overhead, sudden and deafening after the silence. David's hands shook as he scanned the ground where the figure had been. Only trampled ferns and a single footprint, too large, too deep, the toes splayed wide. He followed the prints backward, retracing his steps to Eric's campsite, but the tent was gone. Not dismantled. Gone as if it had never been pitched. The granola bar wrapper fluttered from a branch, impossibly sun-bleached. David stood frozen, the revolver heavy in his grip. The forest pulsed around him, alive in a way that felt wrong, like the trees were holding their breath. He thumbed the safety off, though he doubted bullets would matter here. The notebook's warnings gnawed at the edges of his mind. It mimics voices. A rustle came from behind a thicket of devil's club, dry leaves shifting without wind. David pivoted, gun raised, but the undergrowth was still. Then the whispers began. Not one voice, but dozens overlapping in a chorus of half-formed words. Some he recognized. Eric's panicked "help me." Marjorie's hummed him, even his own name, spoken in his father's long-dead rasp. The air thickened, tasting of copper and pine resin. David backed toward the trail, boots sinking into loam. The whispers coiled around him, pressing close as fog. He fired once into the canopy, a warning shot that echoed like a thunderclap. The forest fell silent. For 3 heartbeats, there was only the smell of gunpowder and his own ragged breath. Then laughter bubbled up from the earth itself, guttural and wet, as if the soil had learned to mock him. He ran. Branches lashed at his arms, drawing blood, but he didn't slow until he hit the service road. The midday sun painted the gravel blinding white, yet the chill in his bones refused to thaw. The radio on his belt squawked dispatch, asking for his status. David keyed the mic, throat tight. "Sector 7 clear," he lied. "No sign of Langley." Static hissed back, and for a second he swore he heard Eric sobbing beneath the white noise. David's fingers trembled as he secured the cabin door behind him, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place, a feature he'd never used in 19 years. The radio hissed on the counter, still tuned to dispatch, but the static had taken on a rhythmic quality, like something was breathing into the receiver. He stared at it, half expecting the voice to return, but it remained stubbornly silent. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the loose pane above the sink in a way that felt deliberate, mocking. He didn't realize he was still holding the revolver until his palm ached from the grip. The barrel was warm, the scent of gunpowder clinging to his uniform. David exhaled and forced himself to holster it, though his fingers lingered near the strap. The notebook lay open on the table where he'd left it, the page still displaying that final, frantic entry. "It mimics voices now." He flipped it shut with more force than necessary, as if the act could seal away whatever lurked in its pages. The shower ran cold, but David didn't adjust the knob. The icy water grounded him, sharpened the edges of his thoughts. He scrubbed at his arms where the branches had scratched him, the soap stinging in the cuts. For a fleeting moment, he considered reporting what he'd seen, asterisk almost asterisk seen. But the words died before they reached his lips. What would he say? That the forest had swallowed a kid whole and spit back a nightmare wearing his face. They'd pull him off duty faster than he could say, "Stress leave." By dusk, the silence outside had thickened again. David sat at the cabin's small kitchen table, methodically cleaning his revolver by lantern light. The routine calmed him, the familiar click of the cylinder, the oiled rag gliding over the barrel. Then the radio crackled to life. The radio hissed, static curling into syllables that almost formed words. David's fingers froze on the revolver's cylinder. The voice, if it was a voice, wasn't Eric's this time. It was deeper, rougher, a sound like bark scraping against bone. "You shouldn't have come back." The words dissolved into white noise, leaving behind a wet, rhythmic clicking. David's knuckles whitened around the gun. He knew that voice. Old Man Harlow, S. Dead 12 years next Tuesday. The lantern flickered, casting elongated shadows across the cabin walls. One of them moved wrong, too fluid, too deliberate, stretching toward the rifle rack by the door. David didn't blink. He'd seen shadow play before, tricks of fatigue and fear. But then the shadow twisted, its edges rippling like heat haze, and the rifle slid from its hooks with a metallic clatter. David was on his feet before it hit the floor, revolver trained on the empty space where the shadow had been. The rifle lay untouched. The rack swayed gently, as if nudged by a breeze. The windows were shut. David exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. He picked up the rifle, checked the chamber, empty. Of course it was, he always unloaded it after patrol. The radio crackled again, this time with dispatch's crisp tone. "Ranger Flogsworth, report." Normal, professional, no static. David keyed the mic, his voice steadier than he felt. "Station 7 secure, no further signs of Langley." The lie tasted like old pennies. Dispatch acknowledged, then signed off. The silence afterward was worse. He slept fitfully, the revolver under his pillow, the notebook burning a hole in his desk drawer. Dawn came gray and muted, the forest shrouded in mist so thick it clung to his uniform like spiderwebs. David checked the perimeter before coffee, his boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass. The footprints were back, fresh ones this time, circling the outhouse, toes dragging deep furrows in the dirt. They led to the woodpile, to the tarp he'd thrown over it yesterday. The tarp was now heaped in a mound as if something had burrowed beneath it. David's fingers curled around the revolver grip beneath his jacket as he approached the woodpile. The tarp sagged unnaturally in the middle, like something with too many angles was crouched beneath it. A smell hit him, sour milk and wet fur, unmistakable now. His boot nudged the tarp's edge, and the fabric slithered aside with a sound like shedding skin. Beneath it lay Eric's backpack. Not torn, not discarded, but arranged. The contents neatly spread across the split logs, a water bottle, a compass, a paperback with dog-eared pages. On top sat Eric's wallet, flipped open to his college ID. The plastic was warped as if held near a heat source, but the grin in the photo was undeniably his. David's throat tightened. He'd seen that same grin when the kid had joked about bringing extra granola bars for the bears. A twig snapped behind him. David whirled, revolver clearing leather, but the mist swallowed whatever had made the sound. Then the whispers began, not from one direction, but from everywhere, threading through the trees like spider silk. "You shouldn't have looked." The voice was Eric's again, but fractured, layered with something guttural. The underbrush rustled 20 feet to David's left, then 30 feet right, as if the thing couldn't decide where to pretend to be. David backed toward the cabin, eyes scanning the mist. Movement flickered at the periphery, a shape too tall for the birch it stood beside, its outline smudged like charcoal. It stepped forward and the forest floor didn't crunch beneath it. The mist swirled where legs should have been. "Help," it sighed, elongating the word into a hiss. The face that emerged from the fog was Eric's, but the eyes were all wrong, pupils slit vertically like a cat's, reflecting the dull dawn light. David's finger twitched against the revolver's trigger, but he didn't fire. The thing wearing Eric's face tilted its head, the motion too fluid, too wrong, like a puppet learning its strings. "Help," it repeated, this time in Marjorie's voice, the cadence perfect, right down to the way she'd always hummed after speaking, as if every sentence needed a musical footnote. The sound coiled around David's ribs like a vice. He'd heard that hum for 6 years, right up until the morning he'd found her cold in her bunk. The mist thickened, swallowing the thing's legs whole. Only its face remained, floating disembodied above the ferns, Eric's grin stretching wider than any human mouth should. David's boot hit the cabin step behind him. He didn't remember backing up. The thing's head lolled, neck elongating like taffy, and the voice that came out was Eric's or Marjorie's anymore. It was David's own. "You shouldn't have looked." The radio inside the cabin crackled to life, spitting static so loud it rattled the window panes. David flinched. The thing in the mist smiled at the sound, its lips splitting further, revealing too many teeth, thin and translucent as fish bones. Then it dissolved, the mist collapsing inward where it had been, leaving only the sour milk stench and the whisper of birch leaves rubbing together. Like laughter. David bolted the door behind him, hands shaking. The radio was silent now, the dials untouched. He stared at it, half expecting the static to return, but the cabin was eerily quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest echo of humming, Marjorie's hymn, the one she'd sung every Sunday as she needed dough. David's stomach twisted. He'd buried her with that hymn playing on a tinny portable speaker, the batteries dying before the song could finish. The hymn faded, replaced by the slow, deliberate creak of the outhouse door swinging open. David didn't need to look out the window to know it was empty, had been empty since winter when the pipes froze solid. Yet the hinges groaned again, louder this time, as if something heavy leaned against them. He pressed his palm flat against the cabin wall, feeling the vibration travel up his arm. Thump, like a fist testing the wood. Thump, thump, closer now, near the window. David exhaled through his nose, forcing his fingers away from the revolver. He reached for the radio instead, thumbing the mic. "Dispatch, this is Station 7, requesting immediate backup." Static hissed back. Then, clear as creek water, "No backup coming, Davy." The voice was Old Man Harlow's, but the chuckle that followed was Eric's, high-pitched, unhinged. David dropped the mic like it had burned him. Outside, the dragging footsteps circled the cabin again, this time pausing beneath the loose windowpane. The glass fogged over, not from warmth, but from something exhaling against it. David watched, paralyzed, as a handprint appeared on the pane, too large, fingers splayed like a starfish, the webbing between them stretched too thin. It lingered for 3 heartbeats before sliding downward, leaving a trail of something dark and viscous. The radio exploded with noise, a dozen voices overlapping, howling in languages David didn't recognize, punctuated by wet, ripping sounds. He lunged for the volume knob, but the voices only grew louder, resolving into a single phrase: "Open the door." It wasn't a request. The cabin's walls vibrated with the force of it, dust sifting from the rafters. David's knees locked as the handprint smeared into nothingness. The radio's shrieking voices cut off mid-sentence, leaving his ears ringing. Silence pooled in the cabin like spilled oil. Then asterisk tap, a single fingernail against glass. David didn't turn. He knew what he'd see, the window empty save for his own reflection, pale as a grub under a rotted log. Another tap, this time on the roof, directly above his bunk. Something heavy shifted in the rafters. Dust sifted down. The revolver was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to draw it. David pivoted, aiming at the ceiling just as the scratching began, long, deliberate strokes like something testing the wood grain with a blade. No, not a blade, claws. The sound moved in a slow circle above him, pausing directly over the lantern. The flame guttered, though no draft touched it. Shadows leapt across the walls in jagged arcs. A thud shook the cabin's north wall, the sound of a body hitting timber. David's breath hitched. The impact had been at head height, his head height, as if something had thrown itself against the wall to mimic his own stature. Then another thud, closer to the door. Then another, faster now, the impact circling the cabin like a heartbeat. David's fingers tightened around the revolver. His training screamed at him, asterisk barricade, fortify, wait for daylight, asterisk, but his gut whispered darker truths. Daylight hadn't stopped Eric from disappearing. The radio crackled again, this time with dispatch's voice, real, human, blessedly mundane. Station 7 confirmed status. David lunged for the mic, his free hand trembling. "Under siege," he rasped. "Unknown hostiles, requesting immediate." The transmission dissolved into static. When dispatch replied, the voice was wrong, too slow, too wet. "Station 7E," it drawled, stretching the syllables like taffy. "Knew a one's coming." The lantern flame guttered out with a hiss, plunging the cabin into darkness so complete David felt it press against his eyeballs. The scratching on the roof stopped. The silence was worse. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked, not the wind but the deliberate snap of something testing its weight. David exhaled through his nose, counting the seconds until his eyes adjusted. When they did, the shadows had rearranged themselves. The rifle rack was empty now. A wet, rhythmic clicking started near the door. David pivoted, revolver aimed at chest height, but the sound wasn't coming from the doorway. It was coming from inside the cabin, from under the bed, slow, deliberate, like a cricket the size of a man folding and unfolding its mandibles. David's finger hovered over the trigger. He'd checked under that bed every morning for 19 years. Always empty. Always. The radio burst to life again, this time with a sound like 100 mouths chewing sinew. Beneath the static, a voice, asterisk his asterisk voice, murmured, "You looked when you shouldn't have." David's own breath roared in his ears. He'd heard that phrase before. 6 years ago, kneeling beside Marjorie's bunk, her hymn book still open to "Shall We Gather at the River." Her lips had been blue. Her eyes weren't closed. They were gone, scooped clean as eggshells. The coroner called it post-mortem scavenging. David had known better. Something scraped against the floorboards beneath the bed. Not claws this time, fingernails. Human fingernails dragging in short, spasmodic jerks. David's throat closed. He knew that rhythm. Knew it from the time he'd found a hiker seizing in a thicket, her fingers clawing grooves in the dirt as her pupils dilated into black pits. She'd been speaking in tongues when he reached her. Not words, clicks. David's breath fogged the revolver's barrel as he leveled it at the space beneath the bunk. The clicking escalated, not random now, but patterned, deliberate. A language. The floorboards groaned as weight shifted under them. Too much weight for the shallow crawl space. His finger twitched against the trigger just as the radio burst into static again, drowning out the sound with a scream that wasn't human, wasn't animal, but something freshly torn. The scream cut off abruptly. In the ringing silence, David heard the first pop like a knuckle cracking, then another, and another moving up from under the bed toward the footboard. The air smelled suddenly of wet clay and spoiled meat. David backed toward the door, his heel catching on the rug Marjorie had woven years ago. The pop became a creak, the sound of joints realigning under pressure. The bunk's frame shuddered. Something pale emerged from beneath the bed, not a hand, but the idea of one, fingers too long, knuckles bulbous as tree knots. It gripped the footboard and the wood blackened where it touched as if scorched by cold. David's training evaporated. He fired. The report shattered the cabin's fragile silence. The thing jerked back with a wet thock like an axe sinking into damp pulp. For half a second, David thought he'd heard it. Then laughter bubbled up from beneath the bunk, guttural and wet. The hand, if it was a hand, twisted its wrist in a motion that made David's tendons ache in sympathy. The fingers spread wide, webbing stretched translucent between them and pushed. The bunk lifted clean off the floor, flipping onto its side with a crash that sent David's spare boots rolling. In the space where the bed had been, the floorboards were warped upward, splintered around a hole that hadn't been there at dawn. David's revolver trembled in his grip as the hole in the floorboards yawned wider, splinters curling inward like blackened petals. The smell hit him first, wet earth and rancid fat, the stench of a gut paw left to rot in July heat. Then the fingers emerged, not one set but dozens, pale and jointed all wrong, knuckles bending in directions that made David's stomach lurch. They scrabbled at the floor's edge, hooking into the wood with a sound like deer antlers dragging across bark. The radio shrieked to life again, spewing static that resolved into Marjorie's humming, the hymn she'd sung the morning they'd found her, the one that had died with her halfway through the second verse. David's jaw clenched. He'd know that off-key warble anywhere. The fingers paused their scratching as if listening. Then, horrifyingly, they began to tap in time with the melody, each knuckle striking the floorboards in perfect syncopation. David's retreating heel hit the doorframe. Cold seeped through his uniform shirt, not from the night air but from the hole itself, exhaling a chill that frosted the nails in the walls. The tapping fingers quickened, the rhythm shifting into something primal, something that set David's teeth vibrating. He raised the revolver, aiming for the center of that writhing mass, but the barrel dipped without his command. His arm had gone numb below the elbow. From the hole's depths came a wet, papery rustle, the sound of something unfolding itself after long confinement. The fingers stilled. The radio died mid-note. Then, with the inevitability of a corpse surfacing in a still pond, a face breached the opening. Not Eric's, not Marjorie's. David's own features stared back at him, skin stretched too tight over the bones, lips peeled into a grin that showed every tooth in his head, and several that shouldn't have been there. David's reflection blinked, not in unison with him but a half-second delayed, as if the thing beneath the floorboards was learning how eyelids worked. The grin widened further, splitting the face vertically at the corners until the jaw hung slack like a broken drawer. From that black maw, a sound emerged, not laughter but the wet, clicking rhythm he'd heard beneath the bunk, now forming syllables. David. His own voice, warped as if played through a waterlogged speaker. The fingers around the hole flexed, knuckles popping like green wood in a fire. David's paralysis broke. He fired 3 times, center mass, just like training, but the bullets passed through the grinning face as if it were smoke. The thing's mockery of his features rippled where the shots hit, reforming with his own panicked expression mirrored perfectly. Then it lunged. Not upward, forward. The hole in the floorboards yawned wider as the thing's torso elongated, stretching toward him like taffy. David recoiled, but the cabin wall stopped him cold. The thing's arms, too many now, some boneless as tentacles, snaked around his ankles with a grip like frozen wire. The smell intensified. Rotting pumpkins, sour milk, the iron tang of a butcher's sink in August. David's revolver clicked empty. He threw it at the thing's face, his face, and the steel passed harmlessly through, clattering into the hole. The thing tusked with his tongue, the sound dripping with false pity. Its fingers, were they fingers? Tightened, and agony shot up David's legs as frostbite bloomed beneath his socks. He could feel the skin splitting, could hear it like celery snapping in winter air. David's scream tore from his throat as the frostbite crawled up his shins, but the sound died halfway, choked off by an invisible force clamping his windpipe shut. The thing wearing his face tilted its head, mimicking his strangled expression with grotesque precision. Its fingers, if they could still be called that, were spreading now, elongating into jointless tendrils that slithered up his calves like ivy choking a tree. The radio burst to life again, spitting out Marjorie's hymn in broken, skipping fragments. The thing's grin widened at the sound, its jaw unhinging further until David could see the glistening darkness where its throat should have been. From that void came a wet, staccato clicking, the same rhythm he'd heard beneath the bed, now synchronized with the hymn's offbeat meter. David's vision tunneled as the tendrils reached his knees. He could feel them probing, pressing against his bones as if searching for marrow. His fingers scrabbled at the doorframe behind him, nails splintering against the wood. Then contact. The iron bolt, cold and solid. He wrenched it sideways with the last of his strength. The cabin door flew open with a violence that shouldn't have been possible, torn from its hinges by an unseen force. Night air rushed in, thick with the scent of pine and something older, something that made David's sinuses burn. The thing holding him recoiled, its tendrils loosening just enough for David to twist free. He hit the ground hard, palms skidding across the floorboards as he lunged for the doorway. David's knees hit the porch steps as he spilled into the night, the cold air searing his lungs. Behind him, the cabin door hung crooked on one hinge, swinging in a wind that hadn't been there moments before. The thing inside, the thing wearing his face, hadn't followed. Not yet. But the silence was worse than any pursuit. His legs gave out halfway to the radio jeep. The frostbite had receded to a dull burn, but his calves were mottled purple, the skin splitting where the thing's fingers had gripped him. David dragged himself upright using the jeep's bumper, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The keys were still in the ignition, a habit Marjorie had always scolded him for. The engine turned over on the third try, the headlights carving shaky paths through the mist. David jammed the gearshift into reverse just as the cabin's remaining window exploded outward, not from impact, from pressure, like something too large had forced itself through the frame. He didn't look back. The Jeep's headlights carved through the mist like a blade through cobwebs, revealing shapes that shouldn't exist, trees bent double as if in prayer, shadows that moved against the wind. David's hands shook on the wheel as the radio crackled to life without being touched. Static resolved into Marjorie's voice, but the words were wrong. "You left the door open." Something heavy landed on the roof with a metallic thum, denting the sheet metal inches above David's head. The steering wheel jerked in his hands as claws, too many claws, scored through the Jeep's soft top. Cold air rushed in, smelling of wet fur and something sweetly rotten, like apples left to ferment in a sealed jar. David stomped the accelerator. The Jeep lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. In the rearview mirror, the cabin's front door hung crookedly from one hinge, swinging in a wind that wasn't blowing. Something pale crouched in the doorway, too tall to be human, too angular to be animal. It unfolded itself with the terrible patience of a spider emerging from a drain. The radio screeched, then died. The headlights flickered. For 3 heartbeats, David drove blind through the mist before the beam steadied. When they did, the road ahead was no longer empty. A figure stood at the tree line, Eric, or something wearing Eric's face, his uniform streaked with mud that might have been blood in the yellow light. The boy's mouth moved soundlessly, forming words David couldn't hear over the engine's roar. David's foot hovered over the brake for half a second, training warring with instinct, before he wrenched the wheel left. The Jeep's tires skidded on wet gravel as Eric's figure lunged, arms outstretched in a parody of desperation. The headlights caught the boy's face in freeze frame. Lips peeled back from teeth that tapered to needle points, pupils slit vertically like a cat's. Then impact. The Jeep hit Eric at 40 miles per hour. There was no thump of flesh, no crack of bone, just a wet pop as the figure burst like a overripe fruit, showering the windshield with black fluid that sizzled where it touched hot metal. David didn't slow. In the rearview, the thing was already reforming, its limbs stretching like taffy to pull the scattered pieces back together. A new sound cut through the engine's roar, chittering from the roof. David glanced up just as a talon hand punched through the soft top, missing his face by inches. The claws flexed, each digit jointed in too many places, and began methodically peeling back the canvas like skin from an orange. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of turned earth and copper. The radio suddenly blared to life, spewing static that resolved into Marjorie's voice. Not the hymn this time, but the last words she'd ever spoken to him. "David, check the cellar trapdoor." The night before they'd found her, David's fingers tightened on the wheel. There was no cellar at Station 7, only a crawlspace beneath the floorboards. The Jeep's headlights flickered again as David veered onto the main access road, or what should have been the main road. The trees here grew too close, their branches interlacing overhead like grasping fingers. The odometer read 12 miles since the cabin, but the terrain felt unfamiliar, as if the forest had rearranged itself in his absence. A wet plop hit the dashboard, then another. David wiped his face, not rain but something viscous and dark dripping from the torn roof. The scent hit him next, fermented honey and gangrene. Above him, the claws had stopped tearing. Now they tapped, an erratic rhythm that matched the clicking from the cabin floor. The radio hissed. "David," his name, but spoken in Marjorie's voice with Eric's wet, clicking undertone. The Jeep's engine sputtered. The headlights dimmed to a sickly yellow, revealing figures standing between the trees. Not just Eric now, but shapes with too many joints, their faces smooth and featureless until the light hit them just right. Then they wore his reflection. The engine died. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the tapping on the roof had stopped. David's breath fogged in the sudden cold as he reached for the door handle, then froze. Outside, the figures hadn't moved. Their heads were tilted at identical angles, as if listening to something beneath the earth. The Jeep's interior lights flickered once and died, plunging David into darkness so complete it pressed against his eyeballs. Outside, the figures remained motionless, waiting. His fingers found the revolver's empty holster, then the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. The blade came free with a whisper of steel, its edge catching a sliver of moonlight that shouldn't have been there. One of the figures cocked its head at the glint. David held his breath as the thing stepped forward, its limbs moving with the stuttering jerkiness of a film strip skipping frames. Moonlight bled across its surface, revealing patches of his own face. His nose here, an eyebrow there, stitched haphazardly over something glistening and black. It stopped 3 feet from the Jeep's grill and extended a hand that was more twig than finger, knuckles bulging like burls on diseased wood. The radio crackled. The radio's static resolved into a sound David hadn't heard in years, his mother's voice, singing the lullaby she'd hummed when he was 6 and feverish. The thing outside tilted its head, its makeshift face rearranging itself to mirror his childhood memory of her. Soft cheeks, the mole by her left eye, lips parted around the melody. It was flawless. It was wrong. David's knife trembled as the thing's outstretched hand flexed, fingers elongating into perfect replicas of his mother's, right down to the chipped nail polish she'd worn the summer she died. "David," it cooed, her voice layered with the wet click of something far older. "You're burning up." The Jeep's hood creaked under sudden weight. David didn't look. He didn't need to. The scent told him everything: damp earth and honeysuckle, his mother's perfume mixed with the reek of a gutted deer left to bloat. Something crouched on the Jeep's hood now, its breath fogging the windshield in rhythmic pulses. Waiting. David's thumb found the knife's edge. Blood welled, hot and startling. The thing outside hissed, its borrowed face twitching as if the scent offended it. The radio sputtered, the lullaby warping into the jagged rhythm of the clicks from the cabin floor. David used the moment to move, not toward the door but sideways, driving his shoulder into the Jeep's passenger window. The window shattered outward with a sound like ice breaking underfoot. David hit the ground rolling, glass peppering his shoulders as the forest rushed up to meet him. The impact knocked the knife from his grip. He heard it skitter across wet leaves, lost in the undergrowth. Above him, the Jeep's hood groaned under shifting weight. Something dropped to the ground where he'd just been. David didn't look back, he ran. Branches whipped at his face, drawing blood as he crashed through thickets that shouldn't have been there. The terrain was wrong, the trails reversed, as if the forest had turned itself inside out while he wasn't looking. His boots sank into loam that clung like wet cement, each step sucking at his soles with obscene hunger. Behind him, the clicking resumed, not pursuit, but conversation, a chorus of wet pops and hisses passing between trees. David's lungs burned as he crashed through a stand of young birch, their branches whipping his face like skeletal fingers. The clicking followed, not matching his pace but hurting him, always just behind his left ear, then his right, as if the forest itself was corralling him toward some unseen destination. He skidded to a stop at the edge of a clearing he didn't recognize, though he'd patrolled these woods for 19 summers. The moonlight here pooled unnaturally bright, illuminating a circle of stumps arranged like stools around a central pit. The scent hit him first, coppery and sweet, the tang of a fresh kill. The pit was shallow, maybe 3 feet deep, but the bottom writhed with movement. David's stomach lurched as he recognized Eric's orange jacket tangled with strips of something pale that might have been skin. The pit pulsed, not with life but with a slow, rhythmic undulation, as if the earth itself were swallowing in great gulps. A hand clamped over his mouth from behind. David jerked, elbow flying back to connect with solid muscle. "Christ, Flogsworth, stop, hissed a voice roughened by decades of cigarettes. Ranger Hollies' grip tightened, dragging him backward into the brush just as the stumps groaned. Not stumps. Not stumps. Knees. The pit wasn't empty. It was surrounded by figures crouched so still they'd petrified into the landscape. Their elongated limbs folded at impossible angles, heads bent forward like vultures at a carcass. Hollies' calloused palm muffled David's gasp as one of them straightened with the creak of old leather, its face peeling open vertically to reveal a mouthful of needle-thin teeth. "Don't breathe." Hollies' whisper tickled David's ear as the thing sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring wetly. The scent of David's blood must have been overwhelming, but the creature turned away, distracted by the pit's contents. Something glistened in its grasp, a human femur, gnawed clean but still dripping. Hollies pulled David deeper into the bracken, their retreat masked by the pit's wet squelching sounds. They didn't stop until they hit the creek, its icy water swallowing their splashes. Hollies finally released him under the cover of a collapsed hemlock. Moonlight filtered through its needles, painting the old ranger's face in jagged stripes. His left eye was gone, the lid sewn shut with what looked like fishing line. "You dumb son of a bitch," he rasped. "I told Marjorie to burn that notebook." David's throat locked. Hollies hadn't worked this sector in 15 years. The forest absorbed sound differently here, the creek's babble muted, the wind absent. Even his own pulse seemed distant. Hollies pressed a rusted hatchet into his hands. The blade was nicked, the edge black with old blood that smelled like pennies and spoiled meat. "They remember steel," he muttered. "But it won't kill 'em. Nothing does." David's fingers closed around the hatchet's splintered handle, the weight familiar yet alien, like holding a childhood toy rediscovered in a nightmare. Hollis exhaled through his nose, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "They'll follow the blood," he murmured, tapping his sewn-shut eyelid. "Took mine as collateral, still owe the rest." The creek's murmur died abruptly, as if someone had turned a faucet off. David didn't need to look. The sudden silence was answer enough. Holly's remaining eye widened a fraction before he shoved David sideways into the shallows. Something whipped through the space where his head had been, leaving a streak of cold air that raised gooseflesh on David's neck. He came up spitting creek water, hatchet raised. The thing crouched on the hemlock log wasn't Eric anymore. Wasn't anything remotely human. Its limbs bent in too many places, fingers fused into chitinous hooks that flexed with a sound like ice cracking. The face, if it could be called that, rippled between stolen features. Marjorie's worried frown, Eric's gap-toothed grin, his mother's lullaby smile. All wrong, all stretched. Hollis moved first, a rusted skinning knife flashing in his offhand. The blade bit into the thing's thigh with a wet thock, black fluid oozing like tree sap. It didn't scream. It laughed, a sound like a dying radio tuning between stations, each burst a different stolen voice. David's muscles unlocked. He swung the hatchet in a short, brutal arc. The blade connected with the thing's collarbone and stuck fast, as if buried in wet clay. The hatchet jerked in David's grip as the thing twisted, not away from the blade, but into it, the wound stretching like taffy to swallow the steel hole. Black tendrils pulsed from the gash, wrapping around the handle with a sound like roots splitting damp wood. Hollis cursed and yanked his knife free just as the thing's fingers elongated into barbed hooks, snagging the old ranger's sleeve. A wet rip filled the air as Hollis tore away, leaving a strip of flannel dangling from the creature's grasp. The fabric dissolved midair, unraveling into threads that wriggled like maggots before vanishing into the thing's palm. David recoiled, but the hatchet held firm. His fingers were sinking into the handle, the grain of the wood fusing with his skin. Hollis didn't hesitate. He lunged forward and slashed at the tendrils binding the axe. The rusted knife passed through them like smoke, but the thing flinched, its stolen faces flickering like a film reel catching fire. For half a heartbeat, David saw what lay beneath, a hollowed-out darkness, a negative space shaped like a man. Then Hollis spat a wad of tobacco directly into the wound. The thing shrieked, a sound that started as Marjorie's voice and ended as a dozen overlapping screams. The hatchet came free so suddenly David nearly toppled backward. Hollis grabbed his collar, dragging him toward the creek as the creature thrashed behind them, its limbs knotting around itself like overcooked sinew. David's boots hit the creek with a splash that sounded too loud in the unnatural hush. Hollis shoved him forward without ceremony, his one good eye scanning the tree line. "Move," he rasped. "They'll come for the iron next." The water was colder than it should have been, not the crisp chill of mountain runoff, but a deep, penetrating cold that seeped through David's uniform like liquid nitrogen. His fingers, still fused to the hatchet's handle, throbbed with a dull ache. He glanced down. Thin tendrils of blackened wood grain crept up his wrist like ivy, the veins beneath his skin pulsing an unhealthy gray where they touched. Hollis didn't wait. He waded upstream, his movements jerky but precise, avoiding rocks that gleamed with a faint, oily sheen. David followed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The creek curved sharply ahead, bending around a stand of dead hemlocks whose branches formed a tangled archway. Something about the arrangement felt deliberate. A wet pop echoed from downstream. David froze. Hollis's hand clamped around his forearm, dragging him behind a boulder just as the clicking resumed, closer now, syncopated, almost conversational. The water around their knees rippled against the current. The creek bed trembled underfoot, not with water, but with something moving beneath the silt. David's boots sank suddenly, ankle-deep in mud gone unnaturally warm. He jerked back just as the sediment erupted in a geyser of blackened water and glistening, segmented things that skittered across the surface like water striders made of bone. Holly's knife flashed, severing one mid-leap. It hit the creek with a sizzle, its carapace splitting open to release a puff of spores that smelled like wet newspaper left to mold. The old ranger didn't pause. He grabbed David's collar again and hauled him toward the hemlock archway, their splashes deliberately uneven. Left, right. A stutter-step rhythm that made the following clicks falter, as if confused. The trees here grew wrong. Their trunks twisted into spirals, bark peeled back in perfect curls to reveal wood beneath that wasn't grain but text. Words David couldn't read yet somehow recognized as his own field reports from years past, the ink bleeding into the creek water as they passed. Holly's breath came in wet rasps now, his sewn-shut eyelid leaking a thin yellow fluid that dripped onto his jacket with a sound like tapping Morse code. They burst into a clearing where the moonlight pooled thick as oil. At its center stood Marjorie's patrol jeep, rusted to the frame, vines strangling the steering wheel but undeniably hers. The radio antenna swayed without wind, transmitting static that resolved into a perfect imitation of dispatch Karen's voice. "Station 7, confirm your," before dissolving into the wet chitter of countless mandibles. The jeep's passenger door hung ajar, its hinges squealing like a dying animal as David approached. Inside, Marjorie's thermos lay on its side in the cup holder, the lid unscrewed, just as she'd left it that final morning. Steam curled from the rim. David's stomach lurched. 19 years buried and her coffee was still hot. Holly's didn't hesitate. He wrenched the driver's side door open with a rusted shriek and began rifling through the glove box. "They plant memories like landmines," he muttered, tossing aside a waterlogged map that dissolved midair into strands of black lichen. "Don't touch anything that—" David wasn't listening. His fingers brushed the thermos. The metal burned. A vision slammed into him with the force of a rifle butt, Marjorie's hands shaking as she poured the coffee, her fingernails crusted with dirt that hadn't been there at breakfast. Behind her, the cabin window reflected movement in the trees. Something tall, something wrong. The memory shattered as Holly's backhanded him across the jaw. David staggered, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. The old ranger's knife hovered an inch from his throat. "I said don't touch," Holly's hissed. Behind him, the thermos rolled onto its side, leaking a dark fluid that ate through the floorboards like acid. The radio antenna snapped with a crack like breaking bone. David reeled back, the hatchet still fused to his palm, its wooden veins pulsing in time with his racing heart. Holly's didn't lower the knife. His single eye flicked toward the tree line where the shadows stretched too long, branches warping into grasping fingers, roots coiling like intestines beneath the soil. Something moved in the jeep's rearview mirror. Not reflection. Memory. Marjorie's face, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream, her pupils splitting vertically like a cat's. David's breath hitched. The thermos rolled again, its steaming contents spilling across the rusted floorboards in a pattern that spelled run. Holly's grabbed David's wrist, the one not melded with the hatchet, and pressed the blade of his skinning knife against the creeping wood grain. "This'll hurt," he muttered and sliced. The pain was electric. David's knees buckled as the knife severed the tendrils binding him to the weapon, each fiber shrieking like nails on slate. The hatchet clattered to the ground, its handle writhing like a severed worm. Black sap bubbled from the wound on David's palm, smelling of petrol and rotting meat. David's vision whited out as the pain radiated up his arm. When it cleared, Holly's was already dragging him toward the tree line, the old ranger's breath coming in wet rasps that smelled of blood and chewing tobacco. Behind them, the hatchet handle sprouted thin, black roots that burrowed into the earth with audible pops. "Don't look back," Holly's wheezed, but David did, just in time to see the jeep's rearview mirror crack diagonally, Marjorie's screaming reflection splitting like a broken film reel. The thermos erupted, spraying steaming black fluid that crystallized midair into thousands of needle-thin shards. Holly's yanked David sideways as the projectiles embedded themselves in tree trunks with harmonic pings, vibrating like struck tuning forks. The forest here breathed wrong. Birches leaned at angles impossible for their root systems, their bark peeling away to reveal wet, glistening muscle beneath. Hollies moved with jerky certainty, following some unseen path only his remaining eye could trace. David's butchered hand throbbed in time with his pulse, each beat squeezing more of that foul sap onto the leaf litter. They hit a service road, or what had once been a service road. Now it was a tunnel of grasping branches, the asphalt buckled into waves that froze mid-curl. Hollies paused at the edge, his knife hand trembling. "This far and no farther," he muttered, more to himself than David. The old ranger's boots left no prints in the road's cracked surface. The road stretched before them like a blackened vein, pulsing under the moonlight. Hollies took a step forward, then crumpled mid-stride, his knife clattering against the asphalt. David barely caught him, the old ranger's weight sudden and boneless. Hollies' sewn-shut eyelid had split open, leaking that same yellow fluid, but now it pooled thick as syrup down his cheek. Inside the socket, something glistened, not an eye, but a knot of wet roots twitching in time with the forest's unnatural rhythm. "They're calling it back," Holly slurred, his voice fraying at the edges. He gripped David's wrist with surprising strength, pressing something cold and metallic into his palm, a key, ancient and pitted, its teeth worn smooth. "Marjorie's cache, North Ridge, burn everything." David's fingers closed around the key just as Holly's convulsed, his spine arching like a bowstring. The roots in his eye sockets surged, burrowing deeper with a sound like celery snapping. His remaining eye locked onto David's, pupils dilating into black pits. "Don't let it taste you," he rasped, then went rigid, his last breath escaping as a whispered name, "Marjorie." The forest exhaled. Holly's body collapsed into itself, skin splitting along invisible seams to reveal the hollow beneath. No bones, no viscera, just a writhing mass of moss and beetles spilling onto the road. David recoiled, but the insects didn't scatter. They flowed, forming a perfect circle around the key in his hand before dissolving into the cracks in the asphalt. The key burned in David's palm, not with heat, but with a cold that seeped into his marrow. Above him, the moon bled through the trees in jagged strips, painting Hollies' remains in flickering chiaroscuro. The beetles hadn't scattered. They'd arranged themselves, their carapaces forming symbols that pulsed like a dying man's EKG before dissolving into the road's fissures. David stood slowly, the key's teeth biting into his flesh. North Ridge, Marjorie's cache. The words looped in his head with the cadence of a half-remembered hymn. He took a step forward. The asphalt cracked under his boot, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the unnatural hush. Something moved in his peripheral vision, a flutter of orange fabric caught in the branches. Eric's jacket, empty, suspended at chest height with the sleeves outstretched as if crucified on the windless air. David's breath hitched. The jacket hadn't been there a moment ago. The radio on his belt crackled to life. Static resolved into Marjorie's voice, but wrong slurred, as if her tongue had swollen. "David, he hurts." The transmission cut off with a wet pop. Behind him, Hollies' knife skittered across the road without visible cause, coming to rest against a drainage grate where dark water pulsed like a vein. The grate rattled. David's boot came down on Hollies' knife just as the water beneath the metal slats breathed, a wet, sucking inhale that pulled strands of his hair forward. The key in his palm throbbed, its teeth sinking deeper. He knew that rhythm. Knew it from the time he'd found Marjorie's patrol jeep abandoned near North Ridge, its windshield webbed with fractures radiating from a single, fist-sized impact. No blood, just her thermos steaming in the cup holder. Eric's jacket twitched in the branches, one sleeve curling inward like a beckoning finger. David didn't move. The radio spat static, then cleared into perfect silence, the dead air hum of an open channel with no one transmitting. He'd heard that silence exactly once before, the morning after Marjorie vanished, when dispatch played back her final transmission. 37 seconds of that same hollow quiet before the wet crunch of something biting down on the microphone. The grate rattled again. Dark water seeped between the slats, spreading across the asphalt in a pattern that branched like veins. David lifted his foot. The knife came up sticky, its blade coated in a glistening film that stretched into threads as he raised it. Behind him, Eric's jacket slumped suddenly empty, the fabric collapsing with a sound like exhaled breath. North Ridge, Marjorie's cache. The words looped in his skull as he stepped over the spreading water, his boots leaving no prints on the damp road. The key's cold burned now, a sensation crawling up his forearm like ice forming in his veins. He clutched the knife tighter. Steel. They remembered steel. The forest exhaled around David, a slow, deliberate sigh that lifted the hairs on his neck. The key pulsed in his palm, its cold spreading up his wrist in fractal patterns, veins turning the gray of weathered bone. He stepped over Holly's remains, now just a damp patch of asphalt sprouting thin white tendrils that recoiled from the knife's edge. North Ridge. The words echoed with Marjorie's cadence. He'd patrolled there 100 times, but now the trail markers were wrong. The carved arrows pointed backward. The mileage signs listed impossible distances. The trees leaned closer, their branches interlacing into a tunnel that smelled of wet fur and copper. Halfway up the slope, the radio crackled. Static resolved into dispatch Karen's voice, but the words were backward, syllables unraveling like yarn. David thumbed it off, just as something sighed his name from the undergrowth. Not Eric's voice, not Marjorie's, his own. The cache wasn't hidden. It sat in a clearing where the moonlight pooled thick as oil, a rusted footlocker with M. Flogsworth stenciled across the lid in fading paint. David's breath hitched. Marjorie had never used her maiden name after they married. The key slid home without resistance, the lock clicking open with a sound like a dislocating joint. The footlocker's hinges groaned like a dying animal as David lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a nest of yellowed newspaper clippings, lay Marjorie's service revolver, the one she'd lost 3 months before disappearing. The steel glistened with condensation despite the dry air, its grip wrapped in flaking athletic tape the exact shade of their old high school's colors. David reached for it. The metal burned cold enough to sear. Behind him, branches cracked under sudden weight. David spun, revolver raised, but the clearing remained empty. When he turned back, the footlocker's interior had changed. The newspaper clippings now showed photographs of Marjorie's Jeep abandoned on North Ridge, the images aging decades in seconds as he watched. A single headline repeated across every page: "Why did you stop looking?" The revolver's cylinder clicked open of its own accord. 5 empty chambers, 1 live round. David's breath fogged the metal as he examined the bullet, its casing etched with the same fractal patterns now creeping up his forearm. He snapped the cylinder shut just as something whispered his name from the tree line, this time in Holly's tobacco-ravaged voice. The footlocker shuddered. Its interior darkened, filling with a liquid blackness that lapped at the edges like water in a sinking boat. David stumbled back as skeletal fingers breached the surface, their bones webbed with moss. They grasped Marjorie's revolver and pulled it under with a wet plunk. The liquid rose higher, spilling over the footlocker's edges in viscous strands that pulsed like arteries. The liquid hit the forest floor with a sound like 100 wet mouths opening at once. David reeled back as the black tendrils snaked toward his boots, recoiling only when they met the knife's steel edge. The footlocker groaned, its sides bulging like an overfilled lung. Something moved in that darkness, not the skeletal fingers, but something larger, turning over with the sluggish grace of a waking predator. The radio on David's belt exploded to life, screeching a perfect mimicry of Marjorie's scream, the one from their first anniversary when he'd surprised her with that cabin in the Poconos. The sound cut off abruptly, replaced by the wet crackle of something chewing through wires. David didn't wait. He drove the knife down into the nearest tendril. It split like rotten fruit, spewing a viscous fluid that smoked where it touched the moss. The footlocker slammed shut with a sound like a bear trap snapping. David lunged back as the lock reassembled itself, the key still protruding at a sick angle. Above him, the moon vanished behind a sudden bank of fog that smelled of turned earth and spoiled meat. The clearing's edges darkened, the trees leaning closer as if observing. Something chuckled. The chuckle resonated from beneath David's ribs, a wet, phlegmy vibration that made his teeth ache. He clutched the knife tighter, its blade now streaked with that same black ichor slowly eating through the steel. The footlocker trembled, its rusted surface bubbling like boiling tar. David's radio sputtered. A voice, his asterisk voice, whispered. She tasted like huckleberries. Memory detonated behind his eyes. Marjorie laughing as juice stained her lips that summer afternoon, the way she'd licked it from his fingers with deliberate slowness. The footlocker bucked violently, its hinges screaming as something inside shifted. A seam split down the center of the lid. Not rust. Skin, pale and mottled, peeling back to reveal glistening muscle beneath. David recoiled, just as Marjorie's hand erupted from the gap, fingers splayed in that exact gesture she'd used when reaching for him across their kitchen table. David's breath locked in his throat as Marjorie's fingers brushed his wrist, warm, impossibly warm, just like that last morning. The flesh was perfect down to the scar from their honeymoon skillet incident, but beneath her nails, dirt caked in crescents. Dirt from no forest he knew. The footlocker groaned wider. Her shoulder emerged, then the crown of her head, hair still in that messy bun he'd teased her about, strands clinging to her damp temples. Her lips parted. David. His name dripped from her mouth like honey from a comb, slow and golden. The knife trembled in his hand. Steel. They remembered steel. He pressed the blade to her palm. Her smile didn't waver. Blood welled where the edge bit flesh, but it wasn't red. It pooled thick and black, smoking where it hit the moss. Her fingers flexed around the blade, pulling him closer. "You left the door open," she whispered, Marjorie's voice, Marjorie's cadence, but underneath, the wet click of something adjusting its mandibles. David's grip on the knife faltered, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Marjorie's fingers tightened around his wrist with a crack of breaking cartilage. The pain was distant, secondary to the horror blooming in his chest as her skin split along familiar freckles, peeling back to reveal a glistening black carapace beneath. "Should have checked the thermos," Marjorie's voice sighed from the thing's unfolding mouthparts. The footlocker yawned wider, its sides distending like a snake digesting prey. More hands emerged, Holly's missing rangers, Eric, even a smaller version of his own, all grafted together at the wrists, their fingers interlaced in a grotesque mockery of prayer. David wrenched backward. Flesh tore. The knife stayed embedded in Marjorie's palm, its blade dissolving into rust as the wound sealed instantly. The thing laughed, a sound like ice cracking over a fast river, and unfolded further, its torso rising on jointed limbs that clicked with each movement. The clearing pulsed, trees bent double as if pressed by invisible hands. David stumbled toward the tree line, his boots sinking into suddenly spongy earth. Behind him, the footlocker groaned, its lid slamming shut with finality. The thing wearing Marjorie's face paused mid-crawl, head tilting at an impossible angle. The air thickened into syrup as David backed toward the tree line, his pulse hammering against the cold creeping up his forearm. The thing that had been Marjorie scuttled forward on too many joints, its human skin sloughing off in wet ribbons to reveal chitinous plates beneath. It paused when his heel struck something solid, the footlocker, though he'd sworn he'd moved yards away. The lid gaped open just enough to show darkness stirring inside. A twig snapped behind him. David whirled to find Eric's jacket suspended inches from his face, sleeves brushing his cheeks with the intimacy of a lover's touch. The fabric reeked of stagnant water and something sweetly chemical, like embalming fluid. From within its folds came a wet, clicking purr. The radio on his belt burst to life with a scream so raw it stripped David's breath away, Marjorie's voice, but shredded at the edges, as if something had chewed through the vocal cords. "You promised," it gurgled, syllables punctuated by the sound of teeth on metal. "Promised you'd never." The transmission cut off with a sound like a spine being twisted free. David's retreat became a stagger. The forest breathed around him, birches swaying without wind, their peeling bark revealing moist flesh beneath. He clutched his wounded hand to his chest, fingers stiffening as the key's fractal patterns branched past his elbow. The knife was gone. The revolver was gone. Only the thermos's memory remained, that last, steaming pool-spelling run. David's boots sank into the earth like it was wet dough, each step pulling at him with unnatural resistance. The key's fractal frostbite had reached his shoulder now, the cold spreading in dendritic patterns that pulsed with his heartbeat. Behind him, the thing wearing Marjorie's skin scuttled forward, its movements all wrong, like a marionette learning to walk. A sound cut through the forest's unnatural hush, an engine, distant but unmistakable. David turned toward the noise, his vision tunneling on a flicker of light between the trees. The patrol jeep, still running where he'd abandoned it, headlights cutting through the gathering fog. The radio on his belt hissed. "David," Marjorie's voice again, but warped, as if spoken through a mouthful of broken glass. "You forgot the thermos." Memory detonated. The steam rising from Marjorie's abandoned thermos that morning, the way it had spelled run in the condensation before evaporating. He lurched toward the jeep, his legs moving through the air like it had thickened to syrup. The thing behind him giggled, a sound like ice cracking underfoot. The jeep's engine stuttered as David lunged for the driver's seat, not the smooth mechanical failure of a dying battery, but the choked gurgle of something alive caught in the gears. The headlights flickered, revealing figures standing motionless along the road's edge. Not the twisted parodies from before. These were rangers, or what remained of them. Holly's with his root-swept eye socket, Marjorie's patrol cap still tilted at that rakish angle she'd favored. Even Eric's mud-streaked jacket now filled out by something that approximated shoulders. Their mouths moved in unison. No sound came out. The radio did that for them. "Should have checked the thermos," crackled from the speakers in a dozen layered voices. The jeep's hood dented inward under sudden weight. David didn't look. He twisted the key once, twice, before the engine caught with a scream that tore through the forest's unnatural silence. The figures didn't pursue. They simply watched as David slammed the jeep into reverse, tires spitting gravel. The rearview mirror showed them dissolving, not vanishing, but unraveling like poorly developed film, limbs elongating into black vapor that seeped into the trees. The jeep fishtailed onto the main road, its headlights carving through fog that curled away like burned skin. David white-knuckled the wheel, his frostbitten arm hanging limp, the key's fractal patterns now branching across his collarbone. The radio remained silent. That silence was worse. 3 miles down the access road, the first signpost appeared, bullet-riddled and leaning, its arrow pointing toward a ranger station that hadn't existed since the 70s. David blinked sweat from his eyes. When he looked again, the sign was pristine, freshly painted letters spelling North Ridge, 2MI. His breath hitched. That route had been decommissioned after the '93 landslides. The jeep's temperature gauge spiked into the red. Steam geysered from the hood as the engine began clicking in perfect sync with Marjorie's old pocket watch, the one they'd buried with her. David didn't stop. Couldn't. The rearview mirror showed his own reflection grinning back at him with blackened gums. A figure materialized ahead, not standing, but suspended mid-stride where the road dipped into a culvert. Eric's mud-streaked face tilted skyward, mouth stretched around a silent scream. David swerved. The jeep clipped the figure's outstretched arm with a sound like snapping celery. The rearview showed the limb regenerate before impact, fingers elongating into barbed hooks that scraped paint from the tailgate. The jeep's headlights stuttered as the road buckled beneath its tires, not potholes, but something breathing beneath the asphalt, each expansion cracking the pavement like desiccated skin. David clenched the wheel with his good hand, the other hanging limp at his side, fingers blackened with frostbite. The rearview mirror showed the road stitching itself closed in their wake, asphalt knitting together with the wet sound of a butcher's needle through fat. A new sound cut through the engine's death rattle, a rhythmic thumping from the roof. Not claws this time. Too heavy. Too deliberate. David risked a glance upward and saw the fabric ceiling sagging under the weight of something crouched on all fours. The shape pressed downward until the canvas stretched thin enough to reveal the silhouette of Marjorie's patrol cap, its brim bent at that jaunty angle she'd always favored. The radio crackled to life. "David," Marjorie's voice cooed, layered with the static of a dying battery. "You missed our anniversary." The words triggered a memory, their 5th year, when she'd surprised him with tickets to that awful magic show in Reno. The performer had sawed a woman in half while whistling Moon River. The roof dented further, the canvas parting just enough to reveal one eye, Marjorie's eye, peering through the gap with pupil dilated to swallow the iris. David stomped the accelerator. The Jeep lurched forward as the thing on the roof laughed, a sound like ice cracking over a fast river. The rearview mirror showed the road behind them peeling upward, asphalt curling like burnt paper to reveal glistening musculature beneath. Trees toppled sideways into the maw, their roots dangling like torn veins. The Jeep's headlights flickered again, this time illuminating a figure standing dead center in the road, not suspended or distorted but solid as the pines around them. Marjorie, or something wearing her skin perfectly, down to the chip in her front tooth from that long-ago sledding accident. She held out her hands, palms up, the way she always did when asking him to slow down. The thermos dangled from her fingertips, its steam spelling stop in the condensation. David's foot hovered over the brake. The thing on the roof went still, its weight shifting forward with predatory patience. Then Marjorie's mouth moved. No sound came out. The radio spoke for her. "Should have checked the thermos," it crackled, but the voice wasn't hers. It was David's own, recorded from some forgotten moment and played back through rusted speakers. The realization hit like a gut punch. The thing was learning, adapting, using his own voice now, layered over Marjorie's pleading expression. David's boot hovered over the brake pedal for half a second too long, just enough time for the thing on the roof to plunge its hand through the torn canvas. The fingers were Marjorie's right down to the chipped pink nail polish, but the grip was all wrong, cold and crushing like industrial clamps. David wrenched the wheel left. The Jeep swerved, tires screeching against the buckling asphalt as Marjorie's face pressed through the roof opening, her features stretching like taffy to accommodate the impossible angle. The thermos hit the windshield with a wet smack. Its contents weren't coffee, had never been coffee, but something thick and black that oozed across the glass in vein-like patterns. David flicked the wipers. They smeared the substance into a grinning face, its mouth stretching wider with each pass until the entire windshield was a gaping maw. The Jeep's engine died with a final shudder. Silence pooled in the cab, broken only by the slow drip of liquid hitting vinyl from the thermos rolling on the dashboard. David's breath fogged the air despite the summer heat. The frostbite patterns had reached his jawline now, branching across his cheek like a parasitic vine. Something tapped on the passenger window. David didn't look, couldn't. The tapping became scratching, long, deliberate strokes like someone testing the glass for weaknesses. His breath crystallized in the air despite the humid night, frosting the windshield where the black ooze had retreated. The rearview mirror showed his reflection grinning wider than humanly possible, lips splitting at the corners like overripe fruit. The passenger door handle jiggled. Not the frantic rattling of someone trying to get in, but the precise testing motion of a locksmith. David's frostbitten arm twitched toward the ignition, fingers stiff as driftwood. The key turned with a sound like grinding teeth, but the engine only coughed phlegmatic sparks. Something sighed against the passenger window, a warm human sound that made David's throat tighten. Marjorie's sigh, the one she'd make when he forgot to wipe his boots. The glass fogged where breath should have been, but the condensation formed words. "Let me in." The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse, the awful, expectant pause of a predator waiting for its prey to bolt. David's good hand found the door handle, cold steel biting into his palm. One shove and he'd be out, sprinting into the tree line where the moonlight didn't reach. But his legs wouldn't move. Couldn't. The frostbite patterns had reached his thighs now, weaving through muscle like ivy through a trellis. The passenger window shattered inward, not with the explosive violence of impact, but in slow motion, glass peeling away like petals from a dying flower. David watched each shard turn midair to catch moonlight before embedding themselves in the upholstery. No wind entered. No sound. Just Marjorie's hand reaching through the gap, fingers extended in that exact gesture she'd used when handing him coffee on chilly mornings. Her wedding band glinted. Real. He'd pawned that ring 3 days after the funeral. The thermos rolled off the dashboard, hitting his thigh with a hollow thump. Its lid popped loose, releasing a coil of black vapor that solidified into Marjorie's other arm, complete with the scar from their honeymoon skillet incident. Both hands now framed his face with terrifying gentleness, thumbs brushing his cheekbones. Her skin smelled of huckleberries and damp earth. David's frostbitten arm twitched toward the revolver wedged between the seats. The thing wearing Marjorie's smile didn't stop him. It watched, pupils dilating as his stiff fingers brushed the grip. The revolver's grip burned against David's palm, not with heat, but with the absence of it, as if the steel had leached all warmth from his flesh. His fingers, stiff with encroaching frostbite, curled around it like roots seeking purchase in frozen earth. Marjorie's hands didn't flinch away. Instead, they tightened around his face, her thumbs pressing into the hollows beneath his eyes with dreadful intimacy. "Look at me," she whispered, her voice perfectly balanced between command and plea, the way she'd sounded when coaxing him through panic attacks after Eric's disappearance. David's vision tunneled on her pupils, black pools that swirled with impossible depth. Within them, reflections moved, not of the Jeep's interior, but of the cabin's porch where he'd last seen her alive, the rocking chair still swaying as if recently vacated. The revolver's hammer clicked back. Marjorie's smile widened, her lips parting to reveal teeth filed to points. "You won't," she breathed, and the certainty in her voice was worse than any taunt, because she was right. The barrel trembled against her sternum, but his finger refused to tighten. 3 years of grief had carved a channel in him too deep for defiance. Something moved in the rearview mirror. Holly stood 10 yards behind the Jeep, his silhouette wavering like heat haze. The old man held a gasoline can in one hand and a Zippo in the other, its flame burning an unnatural blue. He didn't approach, didn't speak. Just watched with his remaining eye, the hollow socket weeping black fluid that steamed where it hit the asphalt. David's finger trembled against the revolver's trigger, not with hesitation, but with the creeping paralysis of the frostbite now spiderwebbing up his neck. Marjorie's thumbs pressed deeper into his eye sockets, her fingertips cold as river stones against his temples. The pain was distant, secondary to the horror blooming in his chest as her skin split along familiar freckles, peeling back to reveal a glistening black carapace beneath. "Should have checked the thermos," Marjorie's voice sighed from the thing's unfolding mouthparts. The footlocker yawned wider, its sides distending like a snake digesting prey. More hands emerged, Holly's missing rangers, Eric, even a smaller version of his own, all grafted together at the wrists, their fingers interlaced in a grotesque mockery of prayer. David wrenched backward, flesh tore. The knife stayed embedded in Marjorie's palm, its blade dissolving into rust as the wound sealed instantly. The thing laughed, a sound like ice cracking over a fast river, and unfolded further, its torso rising on jointed limbs that clicked with each movement. The clearing pulsed, trees bent double as if pressed by invisible hands. David stumbled toward the tree line, his boots sinking into suddenly spongy earth. Behind him, the footlocker groaned, its lid slamming shut with finality. The thing wearing Marjorie's face paused mid-crawl, head tilting at an impossible angle. The Jeep's radio hissed, Not static this time, but wet, rhythmic breathing. David's fingers locked around the wheel as the frostbite reached his jawline, fractal patterns branching up into his hairline like creeping vines. Marjorie's hand still framed his face, but her wedding band had begun to melt, dripping liquid gold that sizzled where it hit the dashboard. Behind them, Hollis took a single step forward, the gasoline can sloshing. The blue flame of his Zippo cast long shadows that didn't match the trees, humanoid shapes with too many joints, swaying in time to the radio's labored breaths. David's mouth opened. No sound came out. Marjorie's thumbs pressed deeper, her fingernails peeling back to reveal chitinous hooks beneath. "You promised," she whispered, her voice layered with the buzz of cicadas. The rearview mirror showed Hollis frozen mid-step, his shadow stretching impossibly long to brush the Jeep's bumper. The radio static resolved into a voice David hadn't heard in 19 years, his own, younger self pleading with dispatch about Marjorie's overdue patrol. The recording skipped like a broken record. "Just check the thermos, Karen. She never leaves without," before dissolving into insectoid chittering. Marjorie's hand spasmed around David's face, her fingers elongating into jointed segments that clicked against his skull. The revolver slipped from his numb grip, hitting the floorboards with a thud that echoed like a coffin lid slamming. Hollis's shadow touched the Jeep's rear bumper just as the gasoline can hit the ground, not dropped, but placed, with ceremonial precision. Blue flames raced along the spill toward them, burning cold as dry ice against David's frostbitten skin. The thing wearing Marjorie's face shuddered at the fire's approach, its stolen features liquefying like wax. David seized the moment, twisting free with a wet tear of separating flesh. He tumbled from the Jeep as the flames reached the cab, their light revealing the truth in strobic flashes. The creature wasn't mimicking Marjorie. It was her, or some abominable recombination. Her patrol uniform fused with chitinous plating, her freckles now pores weeping black ichor. Hollis materialized beside David, hauling him upright with strength that belied his gnarled frame. "Run," the old man wheezed, pressing the Zippo into David's palsied hand. Its flame had changed, no longer blue but the vivid orange of a childhood bonfire. The scent of hickory smoke cut through the forest's petrichor stench. The Zippo's flame flickered, casting long shadows that didn't match the trees, human-shaped silhouettes with too many joints, swaying just beyond the firelight's edge. David's fingers convulsed around the lighter, the heat searing his frostbitten skin without pain. Hollis shoved him forward as the Jeep's cab erupted in flames, the fire consuming Marjorie's twisted form with a sound like frying bacon. They ran, not toward any path David recognized, but through underbrush that parted like liquid, branches snapping back to whip their faces. The forest here breathed wrong, birches pulsed with sap too dark, pines oozed resin that smelled of gangrene. Hollis moved with unnatural certainty, his remaining eye fixed on some invisible trail. A new sound cut through their ragged breathing, rhythmic clicking, like stone on stone. David risked a glance back. The firelight revealed shapes keeping pace just beyond the trees, Marjorie's patrol cap bobbing at the head of a procession of melted faces, their limbs moving in perfect synchronization despite the uneven terrain. "Don't look," Hollis wheezed, yanking David sideways as the ground beneath them shuddered. Roots burst from the soil like grasping fingers, twitching toward their ankles. The old ranger's knife flashed, severing tendrils that bled black sap. The roots recoiled from Hollis's blade with a sound like steam escaping a kettle, their severed ends writhing before dissolving into the earth. David stumbled after him, his lungs burning with each gasp, not from exertion, but from the air itself thickening, clotting in his throat like congealing blood. The clicking behind them grew louder, resolving into a rhythm that matched the pounding in his temples. Ahead the tree line parted unnaturally, revealing a narrow ravine choked with dead hemlocks. Their branches interlocked overhead like skeletal fingers, forming a tunnel that exhaled a breath colder than the surrounding night. Hollis didn't hesitate. He plunged into the darkness, his boots kicking up clouds of fine gray powder that clung to David's damp skin. It wasn't ash. Too granular, too alive. It shifted underfoot with a texture like crushed insect wings. David's frostbitten hand brushed a hemlock trunk as he passed. The bark yielded like rotten fruit, revealing wet, pulsing veins beneath. The tree shuddered, its branches clattering together in a mimicry of laughter. He jerked away too late. The contact had left his fingertips tingling with a phantom memory. Marjorie's voice humming Moon River, the scent of her shampoo, the exact pressure of her hand in his during that last hike. The forest wasn't just watching, it was remembering. Hollies grabbed his collar, hauling him forward just as the first of the shapes emerged from the tunnel's mouth behind them. Not Marjorie this time. Eric. Or something wearing Eric's Boy Scout uniform with terrifying precision, down to the mud stains on the knees from when he'd fallen chasing a garter snake. Its head lolled at an unnatural angle, neck tendons snapping audibly with each jerky step. The Zippo flame guttered as Eric's thing stepped into the ravine, its scout knife dangling from fingers too long for a 12-year-old. David's breath hitched. That knife was still in evidence lockup back in Carson City. The creature's smile stretched wider at his recognition, lips splitting at the corners to reveal a second row of teeth. Holly shoved David forward. "Marjorie's cache," he rasped, pointing to a rusted ranger box wedged between two hemlock roots ahead. The metal bore Marjorie's badge number, 037, etched deep as a tombstone carving. David's fingers found the key Hollies had given him, its cold bite the only real thing left. Behind them, Eric's thing began to hum. Not a child's tuneless noise, but Marjorie's exact pitch from their first dance at the Elks Lodge. The sound liquefied David's knees. Holly swore, yanking him onward just as the creature's knife flashed, burying itself in the hemlock beside David's ear with a wet thunk. The blade wasn't steel anymore. It pulsed like living cartilage, veins threading through the handle. David reached the cache as the first whispers reached them, not from Eric's thing, but from the trees themselves. Marjorie's voice overlapping with Dispatch Karen's, with Holly's with his own, all murmuring the same phrase. "Should have checked the thermos." The lock resisted, key grinding like bone on bone. Eric's thing took another step, its uniform sleeves splitting to reveal segmented limbs. The cache door groaned open with the sound of a dying man's last breath. Inside lay Marjorie's field notebook, pages swollen with damp, the leather cover streaked with what looked like old blood. David grabbed it just as Eric's thing lunged, its fingers elongating into chitinous hooks that scraped his shoulder. The notebook seared his palms, its heat unnatural against the creeping frostbite. He barely registered Holly swinging the gasoline can in a wide arc, spraying fuel across the approaching creature's chest. The Zippo's flame danced in David's trembling hand. Eric's thing paused, its head tilting with Marjorie's mannerism, lips curling around a wet chuckle. "Daddy wouldn't," it whispered in Eric's voice layered with something insectal. David's thumb hovered over the striker wheel. 3 years of grief howled through him, but beneath it something colder clicked into place. He flicked the lighter. Blue fire raced up the fuel trail. Eric's thing shrieked, a sound like radio feedback and breaking bones, as the flames consumed its stolen uniform, revealing the glistening carapace beneath. The creature didn't burn. It unfolded, segments splitting apart like a nightmarish Russian doll to reveal smaller, paler versions of Eric nestled inside each joint. Their tiny hands reached for David in perfect unison. Hollies yanked him backward as the cache burst into flames, Marjorie's notebook curling at the edges like a dying moth's wings. The pages blackened, revealing lines of text that hadn't been visible before, Marjorie's frantic handwriting describing holes in the forest that remembered wrong. David's vision swam as the words seared into his retinas. The thermos wasn't hers. The thing put it there. It wanted us to. The notebook disintegrated in David's hands, its ashes swirling upward in a helix of embers that stank of burning hair. Eric's thing collapsed inward, not dying but reconstituting, its smaller versions folding into a single, shuddering mass that sprouted new limbs like a time-lapse of fungal growth. Hollis didn't wait. He dragged David deeper into the ravine, where the hemlock branches knitted together into a suffocating canopy. The air here tasted metallic, thick with the ozone scent of an approaching storm that never came. David's frostbite had reached his collarbones now, the skin mottled in fractal patterns that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. Behind them, the firelight distorted, stretching Eric's thing's shadow into a towering silhouette that didn't match its movements. Its footsteps clicked in perfect sync with David's own, as if learning his rhythm. Hollis suddenly stopped, his remaining eye fixed on a patch of disturbed earth ahead. A single ranger boot protruded from the soil, its laces still neatly tied. David recognized the wear pattern on the sole, Marjorie's, from when she dragged her left foot after twisting her ankle at Redfern Creek. The boot twitched, as if something beneath the dirt was trying to kick free. "Don't," Hollis rasped, but David was already crouching, his infected fingers brushing the leather. The moment he made contact, the earth breathed, a wet inhalation that sucked the boot under with a sound like a throat clearing. David recoiled, but not fast enough. The soil liquefied around his wrists, pulling him forward into the impression of a face forming beneath the surface, Marjorie's, her mouth stretching wide to swallow his hands whole. David's scream lodged in his throat as the earth swallowed his arms to the elbows. The soil wasn't soil anymore. It pulsed around his wrists with the viscous heat of living tissue, contracting in rhythmic spasms that pulled him deeper. Marjorie's face solidified beneath him, her features sculpted from root tangles and wet clay, lips parting to reveal a gullet lined with splintered pine needles. Hollis grabbed his belt, heaving backward with a strength that shouldn't exist in his wasted frame. The old man's boots skidded in the loam, trenching furrows as the ground resisted. David's shoulders popped, first left, then right, as the thing beneath them clenched. A sound like rending canvas split the air as Hollis wrenched him free, trailing ropes of black mycelium that writhed between David's fingers before dissolving into acrid smoke. The boot was gone. So was most of David's left sleeve, the fabric ending in a jagged line where the hungry earth had bitten through. His exposed forearm shone with the same gray sheen as the frostbite creeping up his neck, the skin oddly frictionless, like river stone worn smooth by centuries of current. Eric's thing shambled into view at the ravine's mouth, its scout uniform now fused to the glistening carapace beneath in patches. The creature moved with Marjorie's rolling gait despite its disjointed limbs, its head lolling to one side in perfect mimicry of how she'd carried groceries up the cabin steps. It paused 10 yards away, clicking its two long fingers together in a staccato rhythm that matched the static spitting from David's radio. The radio static resolved into a voice David hadn't heard in 19 years, his mother's, asking why he'd stopped visiting her grave. The dissonance broke his paralysis. He wrenched backward, tearing free from Hollis's grip as Eric's thing cocked its head with Marjorie's familiar frown. The movement split its scalp along the part line she'd always worn, revealing chitinous plates that pulsed like a wasp's nest. Hollis lunged forward with the gasoline can, spraying fuel in a wide arc that caught the creature mid-step. The liquid didn't soak into fabric, it beaded on the carapace like mercury, sliding off with a sound like rain on tin. David's Zippo flame guttered as he threw it. The fire caught anyway, not on Eric's thing but around it, forming a perfect circle of blue flame that cast no heat. Within the ring, the creature's silhouette elongated, stretching into something with too many joints that clicked in time to the radio's warped rendition of Moon River. The earth beneath David's boots shifted suddenly, exhaling a breath that smelled of turned gravesoil and Marjorie's chamomile shampoo. He staggered sideways, straight into Hollis's outstretched arm. The old man's fingers dug into his bicep with desperate strength, his remaining eye fixed on something behind David. "Don't turn," Hollis wheezed. "It's learning your tells." Too late. David's peripheral vision caught movement where no movement should be. the hemlock branches knitting themselves into a lattice that mirrored the cabin's porch railing, down to the chip in the third post where Eric had nicked it with his scout hatchet. A sound like settling floorboards groaned through the ravine, though there was no wood for miles. David's breath hitched as the branches finished their transformation, the exact warp and grain of their porch wood, even the heart-shaped knot Marjorie had called their lucky charm. The smell of pine sap and lemon polish flooded his nostrils, so vivid he could almost see her kneeling there with her cleaning rag, humming as she wiped away the summer dust. Holly's grip tightened painfully. "Breathe through your mouth," he hissed. "It's in your—" Eric's thing moved. Not forward, but sideways, its limbs folding at impossible angles to step through the ring of fire like it was merely a doorway. The blue flames licked harmlessly at its stolen uniform as it emerged inches from David's face, smelling of scout campfires and the strawberry shampoo Eric had used until middle school. Its breath fogged David's glasses with each whispered word. "Daddy forgot the thermos." The radio static resolved into Marjorie's voice, not screaming now but laughing, that full-throated sound she'd reserved for their private jokes. David's knees buckled. Holly's caught him, shoving the gasoline can into his hands with a grunt. The metal was freezing, its surface crawling with the same fractal patterns now creeping past David's collar. David's fingers locked around the gasoline can as Eric's thing leaned closer, its breath frosting his glasses with the scent of burnt marshmallows and scout campfire ash. The creature's smile stretched wider, Marjorie's smile, the one she'd worn when telling him she was pregnant, before its jaw unhinged with a wet pop. Inside its throat pulsed a perfect replica of Eric's Boy Scout neckerchief, the folds shifting to reveal embroidered text that hadn't existed in life. "Daddy's fault." David recoiled, but Holly's was already moving, driving his rusted blade up through the thing's palate with a butcher's precision. Black ichor sprayed in an arc, crystallizing midair into jagged shards that clattered like hail. The radio on David's belt shrieked Marjorie's anniversary scream again, this time warped, stretched thin like tape played backward. Eric's thing staggered, its limbs spasming in disjointed rhythms as Holly's twisted the knife. The blade wasn't steel anymore. It pulsed crimson, its edge smoking where it met unnatural flesh. David caught a flash of something etched along the flat, Marjorie's initials, MRF, carved in her precise cursive. Now Holly's roared. David flung the gasoline can forward in a desperate arc, the liquid sloshing over Eric's thing's grinning face. The creature didn't flinch, just kept smiling with Marjorie's teeth as the fuel dripped down its chin like syrup. The Zippo tumbled from David's numb fingers, bouncing once before Holly snatched it midair. The old man's thumb flicked the striker with practiced ease, the flame blooming blue as Arctic ice. The fire caught, not on Eric's thing but in it, flames licking upward from its gaping throat, illuminating the ribbed chitin beneath the stolen skin. It didn't scream. It sang, Marjorie's voice harmonizing with Eric's childish laughter as the fire consumed its stolen faces. The sound liquefied David's spine. Holly's didn't hesitate. He grabbed David's collar and ran, dragging him deeper into the hemlock tunnel where the branches pressed close as embracing arms. The ravine narrowed to a slit, its walls pulsing with the same veined patterns David now bore on his forearm. His radio spat static, Dispatch Karen's voice repeating sector clear in a loop that sped up until the words blurred into an insectal buzz. Something heavy thudded behind them, shaking the earth with the rhythm of a limping gait. David knew that cadence. 12 years of marriage had memorized the slight drag of Marjorie's left boot after her knee surgery. "Don't look," Holly's wheezed, but David's head turned of its own accord. David's neck cracked with the effort of turning. The thing behind them wasn't walking. It was unfolding, each step stretching its stolen skin like taffy over a framework of jointed chitin. Marjorie's uniform hung in tatters, revealing glimpses of Eric's face embedded in its chest like a cameo locket. The flames hadn't burned it. They'd fermented it, bloating the creature's torso until the ranger badge strained against its sternum with a sound like bending tin. Holly's knife flashed, not at the thing but at David's own sleeve. The blade sliced through fabric and the first layer of infected skin with equal ease. Black sap oozed from the cut, smelling of fermented honey, and the preservative fluid Marjorie had used in her taxidermy kits. "Run or rot," Holly snarled, shoving David forward as the thing wearing Marjorie's face exhaled a cloud of spores that glittered like crushed glass. The hemlock tunnel convulsed around them, branches knitting into a ribcage that contracted with each of David's panicked breaths. His boots slipped on something wet, not mud, but a carpet of shed fingernails, their half-moon still caked with forest loam. The radio on his belt emitted a wet gurgle, then began playing Marjorie's last voicemail in reverse. Ahead, the ravine terminated in a dead end choked with rusted ranger equipment, Marjorie's dented canteen, Holly's missing snowshoes, even David's own lost wedding ring threaded on a length of barbed wire. The wire thrummed as Eric's thing approached, vibrating with the same frequency as Marjorie's humming had during those last sleepless nights before the disappearances began. The barbed wire twitched, not vibrating, but pulsing, like an artery pumping black ichor through its rusted veins. David's wedding ring glinted as it slid down the length of wire, stopping just above a gap in the dead end's wall where two hemlock roots had twisted themselves into a perfect noose shape. Holly's grabbed David's wrist before he could reach for the ring. "That's not yours anymore," he rasped, his voice layered with something that wasn't quite his own. The old man's remaining eye had gone milky, its pupil dilated to swallow the iris whole. David recoiled, but Holly's grip was iron, his fingers pressing into the fractal frostbite patterns until black sap welled up beneath the skin. The thing wearing Marjorie's face reached them then, its steps no longer mimicking her limp but moving with the liquid grace of a predator finally abandoning pretense. Up close, David could see Eric's features swimming beneath its chest carapace, not embedded but gestating, his small mouth working soundlessly against the membrane like a goldfish in a bag. The radio on David's belt exploded with static, then cleared abruptly into dispatch Karen's voice. "Sector 7, check-in overdue. Flogsworth, confirm." The transmission cut off with a wet crunch, replaced by the sound of something inhaling sharply through broken teeth. David's breath hitched as the radio's static dissolved into a wet, rhythmic clicking, the sound of a cockroach's mandibles working in tandem with a human tongue. The creature wearing Marjorie's face tilted its head, the movement too smooth, like a mannequin's head rotating on a greased joint. Its lips parted, and Eric's voice, asterisk his real voice, the one David hadn't heard in 12 years, trickled out. "Daddy, you left the door open." Holly's grip on David's wrist tightened, his fingers now threaded with fine rootlets that burrowed into David's flesh like sutures. The old man's milky eye pulsed, the pupil dilating until it swallowed his face in a black void. From its depths, a single word echoed in Marjorie's cadence: "Thermos." The thing lunged. David twisted, driving his elbow into Holly's solar plexus. The old man folded with a sound like snapping kindling, his ribcage collapsing inward as spores erupted from his mouth in a geyser. The creature wearing Marjorie's face recoiled, not from David, but from the spores, its stolen skin blistering where the powdery mist touched. The spores hung in the air like a poisonous fog, swirling between David and the Marjorie thing with eerie sentience. Where they touched David's exposed forearm, the gray infection receded, not healing but retreating, as if the spores were scouring his flesh clean. The creature hissed, its stolen lips splitting vertically to reveal a second mouth lined with needle-thin teeth. It spoke with Eric's voice again, but the words were wrong. "Daddy, you burned the door." David didn't hesitate. He grabbed Holly's fallen knife, the blade now blackened and brittle, and lunged. The knife shattered against the creature's chest, but the impact dislodged Eric's face from its carapace. It fell with a wet slap, twitching on the ground like a landed fish. The thing screamed, a sound that was Marjorie's or Eric's, but something older, hungrier, and staggered back into the spore cloud. David turned and ran, his boots crushing the shed fingernails underfoot. The barbed wire noose pulsed as he passed, his wedding ring now spinning wildly on its length. He didn't stop. The ravine walls shuddered, hemlock roots uncoiling like waking serpents. Behind him, the creature's screams dissolved into wet gurgles, then silence. The forest opened abruptly onto a service road David didn't recognize. Parked askew in the middle of the cracked asphalt was Marjorie's Jeep, not the rusted wreck he'd last seen, but pristine, as if freshly washed. The driver's side door hung open, the keys still dangling from the ignition. David's breath caught. This was how it had looked the morning she'd left for her final patrol. The Jeep's engine idled with a low, steady hum, too steady, like a recording of an engine rather than the real thing. David's fingers hovered over the door handle, his infected arm throbbing in time with the ticking of the cooling metal. The smell hit him first: strawberry air freshener and gun oil, Marjorie's signature blend. Too perfect. Too right. A shadow moved in the rearview mirror. David spun, expecting the creature, but the backseat held only Marjorie's folded raincoat and a thermos rolling lazily across the floorboards. The thermos, Holly's warning, echoed in his skull. He reached for it, then froze. The lid was already unscrewed. Inside, black liquid lapped at the edges like a tide. The radio crackled to life without static, without preamble. "David," Marjorie's voice soft with concern, "you forgot your lunch again." A pause, the sound of her stirring coffee, the clink of her wedding ring against the mug, details no mimic could know. David's throat tightened. The thermos sloshed as the Jeep's temperature gauge spiked abruptly, the needle quivering at the edge of the red. Something tapped on the roof, 3 precise knocks, their rhythm matching Marjorie's old all-clear signal from their early patrol days. David's hand went to the gearshift, but the stick moved on its own, slotting into drive with a smooth click. The Jeep rolled forward without his foot touching the gas. The Jeep's tires crunched over something brittle, not gravel, but a carpet of cicada husks, their hollow bodies splitting like eggshells beneath the weight. David's fingers trembled on the wheel as the road ahead rippled, asphalt undulating in slow waves that mirrored Marjorie's breathing the night she'd died. The thermos rolled against his boot, its contents sloshing thick as syrup. 3 more taps sounded from the roof, sharper now, impatient. The rearview mirror showed nothing but the empty backseat, though the scent of chamomile shampoo grew overpowering. David risked a glance upward just as the canvas roof sagged inward, forming the distinct impression of a face pressed against the fabric from the outside. Marjorie's face. The thermos lid vibrated, then unscrewed itself with a metallic hiss. Black liquid oozed over the rim, spreading across the floorboards in branching patterns that matched the infection creeping up David's arm. The radio sputtered to life, not with dispatch chatter, but with the sound of Eric's 5th-grade recorder recital playing backward. A single drop of the thermos liquid struck David's boot, eating through the leather like acid. The Jeep's headlights flickered, illuminating a figure standing mid-road, Holly's, or something wearing his ravaged face. One milky eye rolled wildly while the other wept black sap. His lips moved in perfect sync with the backward recorder music. The Jeep accelerated without David's input, tires screeching as it swerved, not around Holly's but through him. The impact made no sound. The Jeep's windshield splattered with black ichor that wasn't ichor at all. It was Holly's remaining eye, bursting like an overripe grape against the glass. David gagged as the liquid slid downward in viscous threads, each strand spelling out words in Marjorie's handwriting. Should have checked the thermos. The wipers smeared it into a grinning rictus. The engine revved higher, the accelerator pedal pressing itself flush against the floorboard. David clawed at the door handle, but the lock clicked down with finality. Outside, the trees leaned inward, their bark splitting to reveal wet muscle beneath. Something long and jointed tapped against the passenger window, Marjorie's fingers, if fingers could stretch 12 inches and taper to needle points. The thermos rolled to a stop against David's boot again. This time, the liquid inside sloshed with purpose, forming a tiny hand that pressed against the interior glass. A child's hand. Eric's hand. David recoiled, his spine hitting the gearshift. The Jeep swerved violently, tires skidding across asphalt that now pulsed like a throat. Ahead, the service road terminated at a ranger station that hadn't existed in 20 years. The original Sector 7 outpost, burned down the summer Eric was born. Its charred timber frame stood pristine, smoke curling from the chimney in perfect white rings. The porch swing moved gently, though there was no wind. David's fingers locked around the steering wheel as the Jeep accelerated toward the resurrected station. The porch swing's chains squeaked in perfect rhythm with Marjorie's humming, the lullaby she'd sung to Eric during thunderstorms. The thermos at David's feet trembled, its liquid forming a second tiny hand that pressed against the glass alongside the first. Twin palm prints fogged the interior, smelling of scout campfires and the antibiotic ointment Eric had hated. The passenger window shattered inward, not from impact but dissolution, the glass turning to viscous syrup that pooled around Marjorie's reaching fingers. Her nails scraped the dashboard, leaving grooves that spelled "come home" in Morse code. The radio emitted a burst of static, then cleared to a child's whisper. "Daddy, the bad thing learned our knock." The Jeep's engine died as they crossed the station's threshold, the headlights dimming to a sickly amber that illuminated the porch in strobe-like flickers. There, swaying gently, hung Eric's backpack, the one he'd lost during that final camping trip. Its fabric pulsed like a lung, the zipper teeth chattering in time with David's racing heart. Black liquid seeped from the thermos, branching across the floorboards to form a crude map of Sector 7. The infection on David's arm throbbed in recognition, its tendrils extending toward 3 marked locations: the ravine where they'd found Eric's scarf, the hemlock grove where Marjorie's radio last transmitted, and here, the station's root cellar, its door slightly ajar. The thermos rolled against David's boot again with a hollow clunk. Its black contents had solidified into a crude key, the same twisted shape as the one Holly's had given him. Outside, the porch swing's chains groaned under sudden weight. Empty. David's breath fogged the windshield. The rearview mirror showed his reflection still grinning, lips now split to the earlobes. He reached for the door handle. The lock clicked open on its own. The station's front door yawned inward as he approached, exhaling air that smelled of wet earth and Marjorie's lavender sachets. Inside, the walls pulsed like a throat. The infection in David's arm twitched in sympathy, its tendrils reaching toward the root cellar door, where Eric's backpack now dangled from the knob, its fabric shuddering as if something inside struggled to breathe. The first stair cracked underfoot with the sound of a snapping femur. Below, the cellar stretched into impossible darkness, its ceiling strung with what David first mistook for dried herbs. Then his boot kicked something soft, Marjorie's patrol cap, its brim stiff with old blood. Above it dangled Holly's snowshoes, their bindings woven from strips of human skin. The root cellar exhaled, a warm, wet breath that carried the scent of Eric's missing baby teeth and the pine tar soap Marjorie used to wash her hair. David's boot sank into the third stair, which yielded like fresh muscle beneath a surgeon's scalpel. Below, the darkness coagulated into shapes, shelves lined with mason jars, their contents suspended in cloudy fluid. One jar pulsed as he passed, revealing Eric's severed index finger floating in formalin, the nail still painted with the chipped green polish he'd stolen from Marjorie's vanity. The fourth stair wasn't wood at all, but a human spine laid end to end, its vertebrae shifting under David's weight with the creak of a rocking chair. The infection in his arm flared, tendrils extending toward a workbench where Marjorie's skinning knife gleamed beside a half-assembled mannequin. The mannequin's torso was hollow, its ribcage woven from barbed wire. Inside, something moved. The radio on David's belt crackled, not static this time, but the sound of Eric blowing out birthday candles, the wet sputter of wax hitting frosting. The noise drew the mannequin's head up with a jerk. It had Marjorie's face, but the eyes were Holly's, one milky, one weeping black sap. Its lips parted. "You forgot the candles," it said in Eric's voice, the words syncopated with the click of a beetle's mandibles. David's wedding ring vibrated against his sternum, its gold gone fever-hot. He reached for the skinning knife, but the blade melted at his touch, dripping onto the spine stair where it hardened into a perfect scale model of Sector 7. Tiny figures moved through its valleys, Marjorie and Eric, their limbs articulated like marionettes, reenacting their last hike with horrifying precision. David's breath hitched as the miniature Marjorie figure paused mid-trail, her tiny hand rising to shade eyes she no longer possessed. The Eric puppet behind her jerked its head toward an impossibly detailed hemlock sapling, its branches already twisting into the same new shape David had seen in the ravine. The scale model thermos at their feet began leaking black fluid that pooled into letters. "Look up." The ceiling wasn't wood. It was a mosaic of human fingernails, each one etched with a date going back decades. Where David's shadow fell, the nails rippled like pond skaters fleeing a predator. Something warm dripped onto his cheek. He touched it, Marjorie's strawberry lip balm, the kind she'd worn every winter. The mannequin's hollow torso pulsed, its barbed wire ribs expanding like an accordion. Inside, suspended in viscous fluid, floated Eric's left lung, still inflating in shallow, shuddering breaths. The radio on David's belt emitted a wet cough in perfect sync. 3 jars vibrated on their shelves, their contents swirling into faces David recognized. Rangers reported missing long before his time. Their mouths moved silently, repeating the same phrase in unison. David pressed his infected palm against the glass. The vibration translated into words, "Check your pockets." David's fingers trembled as they dug into his pockets, the right one empty, the left yielding something small and metallic. The sheriff's badge Holly's had given him back at the ravine, except now its surface crawled with the same black fractal patterns as his infected arm. When he turned it over, the engraved serial number had been replaced by coordinates, the exact location of Eric's last known campsite. Above him, the fingernail ceiling rippled like disturbed water. Several nails detached with wet pops, raining down to embed themselves in David's shoulders with pinpoint precision. None drew blood. Instead, they fused with his parka, forming a crude map across his back, the same trails Marjorie had marked in her final notebook entries. The mannequin's head rotated 180 degrees, its hollow eye sockets tracking each nail's descent with grotesque interest. "Took you long enough," it sighed in Holly's voice, the words punctuated by the sound of roots splitting wood. One skeletal hand extended toward David, palm upturned. Cradled in its fingers was a single hemlock seed pod, the kind Eric used to collect during autumn hikes. The pod split open with a sound like cracking knuckles, revealing not seeds but human molars. Eric's molars. The radio on David's belt suddenly played the sound of his own voice screaming, not from fear, but from the moment he'd yelled at Eric for tracking mud into the cabin. The mannequin's jaw unhinged, its mouth stretching wide enough to swallow the seed pod whole. As it swallowed, the mason jars trembled violently, their preserved contents dissolving into black smoke that coalesced into a single word above the workbench. "Run." David staggered backward as the mannequin's barbed wire ribs expanded, the twisted metal screeching like a wounded animal. The seed pod molars clicked against its hollow insides, Eric's molars, worn down from chewing ice cubes the way Marjorie had scolded him about. The radio static shifted into the sound of that scolding, her voice frayed with static. "You'll crack your teeth, baby." The cellar stairs dissolved underfoot, each step collapsing into soft tissue that pulsed against David's boots. He fell through the last 3 steps, landing in something warm and viscous, not water but liquid that clung to his pants like syrup. The workbench ahead warped, its surface bubbling into a perfect replica of Marjorie's face. Her lips parted, and the smell of chamomile tea and gun oil poured out. "Check the thermos," the face whispered, But the words were wrong, the cadence stolen from Eric's last school play. David's infected arm twitched violently, the black tendrils now branching toward his throat. He clawed at them, but his fingers passed through the infection like smoke. The mannequin took a jerking step forward, its hollow torso yawning wider. Inside, Eric's lung inflated with a wet gasp, the alveoli spelling out a single word in Marjorie's handwriting: hurry. David's wedding ring seared into his finger, the gold now blackened and fused to his skin. The pain was distant, secondary to the realization creeping up his spine. The thermos wasn't in the Jeep. It was here, pulsing on the workbench beside a skinning knife crusted with old blood. The knife handle felt wrong in David's grip, too warm, flexing slightly like cartilage as his fingers closed around it. The mannequin lunged, its barbed wire ribs screeching open wide enough to swallow him whole. David swung blindly. The blade sank into the thing's hollow chest with a wet crunch, shearing through Eric's floating lung. Black fluid geysered, smelling of scout campfires and the cherry cough syrup Eric had hated. The lung collapsed with a sound like a deflating balloon. The mannequin staggered back, its stolen face flickering between Marjorie's and Holly's features before settling into a grotesque fusion of both, one milky eye weeping black sap, the other pupil dilating to reveal the cabin porch where Marjorie had vanished. David yanked the knife free, but the blade stayed embedded in the creature's chest, melting into rust as the wound sealed instantly. The cellar stairs convulsed beneath him, each step now a fused mass of human vertebrae. David stumbled backward into the workbench, his infected arm spasming toward the pulsing thermos. Its surface rippled like living skin, the cap unscrewing itself with a hiss. Inside, black liquid formed a tiny, perfect replica of Eric's face, his lips moving in silent sync with the radio's playback of his last recorder recital. The mannequin's head rotated 360 degrees with a sound like snapping branches. "Should have checked the thermos," it sighed in Marjorie's voice, but the words stuttered like a skipping record. David's wedding ring burned hotter, the fused metal branding his finger with the coordinates from the badge. He grabbed the thermos. The thermos exploded in David's grip, not with heat but with cold, a black frost that crawled up his arms faster than he could scream. It spread in fractal patterns, branching across his chest in perfect sync with the infection already rooted in his flesh. The mannequin's hollow torso yawned wider, its barbed wire ribs screeching open like a bear trap as the frozen darkness swallowed David whole. He expected pain. What came was worse: memory. Marjorie's hand smoothing sunscreen onto Eric's shoulders during that final lakeside picnic. Holly's laughing as he demonstrated how to whittle a whistle from green wood. The cabin's porch swing creaking under their combined weight at dusk, fireflies blinking in time with the radio's static. Every cherished moment played in reverse, each one stripped of warmth until only the hollow shells remained, empty as the mannequin's chest cavity, as the thermos now lying shattered at his feet. David's wedding ring shattered next, the fused metal dissolving into black dust that swirled upward into the shape of Eric's missing scout badge. The cellar walls pulsed inward, breathing in the particles as the fingernail ceiling detached completely, thousands of them raining down to embed themselves in David's skin without breaking it. They arranged themselves into a map across his torso, marking every place he'd failed them. Outside, dawn bled through the root cellar's warped slats in thin stripes that cut across the workbench. The mannequin's frozen scream thawed first, its features slackening into something almost peaceful as the light touched it. One milky eye cleared briefly, Holly's eye, and in that moment David saw the old ranger's cabin reflected in its surface. Not the burned ruins, but as it had been 30 years prior. Smoke curling from the chimney, the porch swing moving gently though there was no wind. Then the eye clouded over again. The mannequin collapsed inward, its barbed wire ribs curling around the ruined lung like petals closing at dusk. David tried to speak, but his throat was packed with cicada husks and the sour taste of Eric's cough syrup. The infection in his arm flowered outward, black tendrils branching across the map of fingernails on his chest, each one a date, each date a disappearance. The radio on his belt crackled to life one final time. Not static, not taunts, just 3 notes from Eric's recorder, the ones he'd played incessantly that last summer. The sound drew the black tendrils upward toward David's mouth. He didn't resist as they pressed between his lips, didn't fight when they unspooled down his throat like a backwards film reel pulling its footage home. Above him, the station's roof peeled away in slow sections, revealing a sky the color of a fading bruise. The trees beyond stood perfectly still, their leaves holding their breath. David's vision darkened at the edges, the infection stitching his eyelids shut with threads of black frost. The last thing he saw was the thermos, reformed now pristine, its surface reflecting not his face but Eric's, smiling. Morning came as it always did in Sector 7, reluctantly, through layers of ground fog that clung to the station like a second skin. The ruins stood silent, roof intact, no evidence of the night's disturbances beyond a single set of fresh footprints leading away from the root cellar door. They weren't human. They weren't animal. They simply were. 20 miles south, a park dispatcher marked David Flogsworth's file, closed, no further action, and reached for the next case. Her radio emitted a burst of static, brief, meaningless, before returning to the morning weather report. Outside her window, a crow pecked at something glinting in the gravel. A sheriff's badge, its serial number worn smooth. The station's porch swing moved gently in the breeze, though there was no wind. Inside the cabin, a thermos sat upright on the kitchen table, its surface beaded with condensation. The radio played static, then 3 clear notes from a child's recorder, then nothing at all. By noon, the fog had burned away. The lake glittered innocently under the summer sun, its surface broken only by the occasional rise of a feeding trout. At the water's edge, a single set of footprints led down to the dock, small ones, the kind made by a child's hiking boots. They stopped abruptly at the 3rd plank, as if the walker had simply evaporated mid-step. The service road remained empty all afternoon. No rangers came to check the barricades. No hikers strayed past the warning signs. Only the trees witnessed the shadows moving where no shadows should be, elongated shapes stretching toward the station at impossible angles, their edges flickering like faulty film. At dusk, the thermos rolled off the table on its own. The impact popped the cap loose, releasing a curl of steam that smelled of pine tar and strawberry lip balm. The liquid inside had turned perfectly clear, save for a single human molar resting at the bottom. It was a child's tooth, its surface pitted from chewing ice. Nightfall brought the clicking sounds again. First from the tree line, then the dock, then directly beneath the cabin floorboards. Something scraped against the foundation, not claws, but the deliberate drag of a skinning knife being whetted. The radio turned itself on at full volume, broadcasting 3 seconds of a woman's laughter before the speakers blew out in a shower of sparks. By midnight, the station's windows had fogged over from the inside. Fingerprints appeared in the condensation, small ones, the size of a child's, spelling out "Dad" before dissolving into runoff. The thermos vibrated violently, its contents sloshing black again as the molar dissolved into a cloud of wingless midges. When dawn came, the cabin stood empty. The front door hung open, its knob smeared with something that might have been tree sap or dried blood. A single set of footprints led away from the porch, adult-sized this time, but they vanished after 12 paces, as if the walker had simply stepped off the edge of the world. The morning sun filtered through the trees in thin, watery strands, casting long shadows that didn't quite match the shapes throwing them. David stood at the edge of the clearing, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds in as many days. The skin around his wedding band had turned gray and smooth, the same unnatural texture now creeping up his forearm beneath his sleeve. In his hands the thermos trembled, not from fear, the capacity for that had left him days ago, but from the pressure building inside it. The metal had gone corpse gold, beaded with condensation that smelled faintly of Eric's Scout campfires and Marjorie's strawberry chapstick. David's cracked lips moved silently, forming words he hadn't spoken aloud in 19 years. Should have checked the thermos.